Okay, this is David Zierler, Director of the Caltech Heritage Project. It's Monday, January 31st, 2022. I'm delighted to be here with Dr. David Bacon. Dave, it's great to see you. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk about some fun stuff.
Dave, to start, would you tell me your current title and institutional affiliation?
So my current title is Senior Staff Software Engineer at Google, and I'm based out of here in Seattle. And I work on the quantum computing group for Google.
Okay, so let's start perhaps with research fields and see where there are intersections. So, of course, your educational trajectory is in theoretical physics. There's software engineering, and of course, there's computer science. Where do these different fields converge on the major research topics that you're after?
So, I mean, my research has always been in all of these. It's kind of an interesting, for a lot of us in quantum computing who started about in the 90s when it sort of really started becoming in vogue, it was very natural because a lot of us were computer geeks to sort of like see quantum computing, computer geeks who liked physics and were good at physics. It was sort of a very natural thing to be like, this field is just set up for us. So, I currently am a software engineer, so I do a lot of building tools and things like that for quantum computing, and I do a little bit of research, sort of on the side. And I've been lucky. I've been able to do sort of all of the different areas, so both in physics and computer science, and even into this area of like building tools for actually making research easier. So.
Dave, I'll ask a series of questions to the extent that you're able to talk about your work, wonderful, and where you're not able to, totally understand. So just as a snapshot in time, what are you currently working on, and how does that fit in with Google's overall project in quantum computing?
That's right. So Google started pretty seriously when they hired John Martinez, which is, I guess, about 5 years ago now. And because that was they'd previously done some work sort of prototyping D-Wave's quantum system. But they sort of went through this period of doing what they call the quantum supremacy, which we now sort of call the beyond classical experiment. And so I got dragged in to sort of work on that. So sort of not specifically on that, to work on software that was necessary for quantum computers. Our current big thing at Google right now is pushing towards error correction. So I'd say it's sort of the main thrust of the team is working on, showing that this idea of error correction actually works, basically. We're sort of at a very fascinating time where error correction for the first time is starting to be implemented in the lab. And amusingly, for a lot of the experiments right now, if you're trying to do error correction and your gates and measurements and things aren't good enough, what actually happens is it's error worsening. It makes things worse. It amplifies in the wrong direction. So we're sort of doing a lot of error worsening experiments right now. But there's ones that are sort of pushing into the boundary of actually performing error correction. And so the team is heavily focused on that. The other thing the team is heavily focused on is what can we possibly use these quantum computers for? So both thinking about what people call the NISQ era, which is a term John Preskill came up with. And then for fault-tolerant quantum computers, when we have them, we really need to understand, we need to bring down the cost associated with all the algorithms. So a large chunk of the team is sort of focused on trying to understand what the applications are, when they'll arrive, trying to make it quicker by building better algorithms.
Dave, what are the ins and outs of software engineering when it's applied to trying to build a scalable quantum computer? In other words, do you need to have a quantum software program in order to make it applicable to what will be a quantum computer?
Yeah, so essentially, a quantum computer, there's the quantum part of the system, and then we're sending in classical control sequences to these machines. And so we have to build the software that controls that, those classical signals. And what's interesting about that is it's a pretty complicated system you need to build, and you need to be able to scale it up. And then on top of that, you need to be able to orchestrate this error correction algorithm. So the joke about quantum computers is they'll mostly be doing error correction. Our current vision sort of doing active error correction is this idea that we're running this very complicated program at the lowest level just to make the machine work. And so you have to build and architect that so that it'll actually work. And it'll really be, in the current, sort of thinking, it's almost like having a classical supercomputer sitting right beside the quantum computer to do this sort of like very, it's not super complicated, but it's just a lot of compute that you need to be doing to suppress those errors. And so there's sort of like this people call it a quantum operating system that you need to build that sort of orchestrates the quantum computation you're doing and the error correction. And then further up the stack, there's sort of like you need to think about how you program these. So what, do you write it in a new language, or to use an existing language and augment it in order to do that? And so one of the things I've done is work on a program called Circ, which was basically a Python framework for programming quantum computers. And what's kind of interesting is that we're very much at the beginning of this story, right? This is not, these original tools that we're building are very much V0s or V-1s of what's going on. So that's kind of exciting because there's a lot of space to improve in that software, because we just sort of don't, the first time you do it, you always mess up. So we're sort of at that era for quantum software. So yeah, it's pretty cool.
Dave, operating in an industrial environment, what aspects of your work and the work of your group are simply fundamental research that's supported by Google, and what aspects of the work are really responsive on Google's overall strategy, where it wants to see quantum computing going?
It's a good question. So, in the case of quantum computing, the way to say it is the smart money knows it's still a long push to get to very practical applications. And so at Google, our CEO, who actually has a background in material science, right? So he actually sort of fundamentally understands that this is an important tool to build, right? They very much understand that it's a long march, right? Some of the stuff that people do is closer to what you would call fundamental in the sense of it's exploratory, like trying to understand noise in our systems is very much trying to analyze, the behavior of the physics of your system, right? And so that's very much, and if an academic were doing this, you'd be like, oh yeah, that seems about right. But then, the actual process of building it has a lot of parts that are like that, but a lot of it are pushing, just engineering to scale this thing up, and the sort of, all of the management and coordination you need to do that. So it's hard to know what the actual mix is at Google, but there's definitely a mix between them. And the thing that I actually think is fascinating is that you see the team pivot back and forth. Literally they sort of go into science mode to try to figure out what's going on. And once they understand it, they go into engineering mode to try solutions, and they go back and forth. And so, I'm always really impressed with the people who are doing this, because I'm not great at that myself, but they watching that process back and forth is really fascinating. And I think even in academia, that occurs at the best times in academia. That's always occurred too, right? Sort of this notion of being not dependent on the hardness of actually carrying out your experiment and engineering it, right? That's always been there, right? And it's sort of in a pretty rapid cycle at Google where we sort of try to go through that. So I'd say that's sort of the lay of the land. On the theory side, it's still all very researchy in a more abstract sense. So people are thinking about algorithms. Some of it's practical in the sense of they're trying to get scaling. They're trying to actually, see how this algorithm would behave. But a lot of that work still is very much hey, what can we do with this, quantum system, right? What are the real algorithmic questions here? So.
Dave, being at Google, what insights have you gotten in terms of quantum computing as really a merging of both theory, experimentation, and engineering or material science?
Yeah, this is actually the best part about quantum computing. It really is about bringing fields together. I have a story from my IQI days about that, which is that when I was originally a physicist, and then when I showed up at IQI at Caltech, I was starting to I was more interested in some sort of computer science questions, algorithms, things like that. And I got put in a room with Sean Hallgren, who was a computer science PhD from Berkeley. And, I was a physicist. I also went to Berkeley. We knew each other a little bit in passing, but it literally took us a year to be able to talk to each other. But it was one of the most productive things that ever happened to me, because being able to speak the language was key. And I think that's actually the most interesting thing to watch at Google, is to watch, the barriers between the different disciplines, trying to break them down and be able to talk to each other. And then you get huge benefit when that happens. It is amazing though, because like on both sides you have like these really brilliant people who literally, the problem is they just don't speak the same language. They've been taught different ways to think about things, and it's hard to convey to the other person without like having gone through the experience of, you know, training and whatever background you had, that understanding. But as it happens, you start to see like a lot of benefits. And it's probably the best part of my job is that I guess, you know, speak to physicists, engineers, you know, I even spend time in the product world, and I've spent time in finance, right? So it's like, oh my God, it's everything at once.
Dave, as you well know, you know, major companies, peers of Google, are involved in quantum computing. Honeywell, Amazon, IBM, the list goes on and on. Do you feel to some degree that all of these companies are in a race? And what might be Google's unique approach if its aim is to get there first?
Yeah, I mean, in some sense, it is definitely a race. The field is still fairly collegial in the sense of, for many years, quantum computing was an outsider's field. And because, you know, nobody believed it was even, you know, you get very dismissive comments when you go talk to physics departments or, you know, try to get a job anywhere. And so for that reason, the community was very tight knit, you know, I would say into the 2010s when that commercial interest started to come around. So there's sort of that still remains. So I'd say it's a race, but people are very cognizant of like, we all really want to build the quantum computer. So we don't really, you know, if somebody else starts doing a really good job, fundamentally, most of the people who've been in the field are like, oh, that's pretty awesome. So that is good. I would say Google has a strong culture of doing hard things. That's the reason when I left, that I always found fascinating about this place is that, you know, that you hear a lot about like Google products that were canceled and things, but there's a lot of stuff that Google does that you never hear about that were people trying hard things, which means, of course, you fail, right? Like, and this is one of these sweet spots of like, this is a really hard thing. It appears to require a lot of engineering right now, right? Like our best ideas do require a lot of engineering. The weakness Google has is it's not, you know, we're not traditionally a hardware company, though we have, you know, moved into that direction, but hardware is hard, as they say, right? So I think, you know, I think there's definitely a culture of trying to do hard things. We do have the advantage also, I will just admit that like Google software engineers are very good. So like we're getting software engineers to work on the quantum team is like super easy because everybody wants to work on it because it's cool and exciting. And we have really high caliber engineers. One of the team members took the physics GRE before he interviewed with our team to transfer. And I think he did better than I did on his score. So it's like, okay.
Dave, a few questions as they relate to process. So as you well know, for example, Google's approach to quantum computing is very different than, say, Microsoft's, for example. So the question there is, one, do you have any insight as to why Google chose the course that it did? And two, is your sense that the approaches are different, but the aims of the outcome are the same? Or is it possible to conceptualize two different processes leading to two different types of quantum computers?
Yeah, so let me take that second one because I think that's actually a fascinating one, which is that, so I spent a year at a startup called IonQ that builds trapped ion quantum computers. And these are very different beasts than the ones Google build, which are superconducting circuits. The trapped ion quantum computers, you know, have some benefits in terms of they, you know, each qubit can talk to every qubit in a trap. Whereas on the superconducting circuit, you lay it out on some grid and only nearest neighbors can talk. So they're sort of different behaviors. Superconducting circuits are faster, much faster than trapped ions, which are slower. And when I made that switch, one of the things I really was thinking about is that there are some places where trapped ion quantum computers seem better, and they're sort of closer in the sense of like quantum sensing applications where you're trying to use the quantum computer as part of a sensing network. Those types of things might occur quicker. Now, in the long run, when you look at the speed of the trapped ions, you're kind of like, you know, if you're a factor of 1,000 slower than your competitor at the base rate, that can be a problem. But I really do think actually there's probably multiple endpoints here, and we'll start to see them emerge probably in the next 5 years, as I do think things like quantum sensors are going to be a major impact, and some physical systems are better for that than others. And then you asked, the other question I guess you asked was about Microsoft and Google, and why did Google go the direction it did? Terry Rudolph has like a very funny quote that's something along the lines of like, everybody in quantum computing works on what they do because that's what they did in grad school, which is actually really true. I mean, it's not true. There's some people who moved. It actually have my personal thing is hire people who move across disciplines because that's really hard, right? And they just give a different perspective. But it really is true that the early days of quantum computing companies have been people who, this is what they did their grad student work on. So like IonQ, it's Chris Monroe and Jungsang Kim and all of the graduate students and postdocs that were building that. And Google was superconducting circuits coming out of John Martinez. So it's these sort of academic cores, and then that they started getting good results, and the companies just, sort of either emerged from them, or in Google's case was, trying to understand what they thought at the time was the best possible path, and John Martinez seemed to be the right fit, and the superconducting circuits. There's another tradition which is sort of associated with Microsoft, which is, topological quantum computers, and this idea that we can build naturally robust quantum computers. And that tradition has, Caltech has a huge part of that story, actually, right? It's sort of, but it's been more challenging than you would expect. In the end, I actually, John Prescott likes to always remind me, he said, I remember Dave Bacon used to always say that we would never build a quantum computer unless it was topological. And so I kind of stuck my foot in my mouth for that. But, in some sense, I believe something like that's still true. I still think that the ideas of topological quantum computing are extremely important. Like the codes, Google's system that they're trying to build is building a topological code. So in some sense, we're sort of we can't build it directly. We're sort of simulating it and doing the error correction part of it. So it's kind of fascinating, right? Those ideas about how to robustly store information in two-dimensional systems, right, sort of are key to a lot of our current efforts. So they're not as far apart as I think people think they are in some ways.
Dave, thinking about comparing and contrasting your experiences at Google versus a much smaller, really a startup, a place like IonQ. What does that say about the state of the quantum computing field, that you can have really tiny startups that are making contributions, and you can have behemoths like Google and Microsoft that are working on it as well? What does that tell us in historical perspective on where quantum computing is right now?
I think what it's pointing out a lot of is just that talent is the key thing right now, and knowledge about how to do these things, right? So in the startups, it has always tended to be small groups of, people who are experts. And if you look at the industrial efforts, that's true as well, right? So Google has, if you look at Google's efforts, it comes out of John Martinez's lab originally, right? If you look at Microsoft, right, like a lot of their efforts in topological quantum computing came from people like Charlie Marcus and Leo. There's sort of like these academic histories of that. And so I think that's because of that, I think it just means that we're still in the stage where we're taking academic ideas and moving them across the divide, right? And it's also true that sort of size of teams, Google's team was always fairly small. And I would say, I think probably the largest now, well, maybe Honeywell is now the largest because they hired CQC. They're probably the largest number of people. IBM is also large. And so we are sort of starting to see the emergence of these much more large, teams that are trying to do things. And it's also this emergence of trying to think about it as a product. I'd say Google is still, in some ways far from that. We still believe that this is a hard problem. And, we want to be prepared for when the product comes around, but it's not the end unto itself right now. And that's very nice. It's sort of liberating. I worry about some of the companies just trying to be too much of a product too early. IonQ, which went public via SPAC, is, one of the challenges they're going to face is they're now, their CEO has to go talk to investors every quarter, right? And that can be a pretty big distraction. I mean, it can be a motivator, but the business can be a pretty big distraction from the real challenge, which is build and scale that trapped ion system up, right? And so, I think that's going to be interesting moving to watch. Is I think you can get distracted a lot by the product. And what's really going to happen is technology is going to win. And so, that's what people should try to focus on.
Dave, I'm curious how much of a challenge the process is where if we don't really yet have a good understanding of what quantum computers will be good for, how difficult does that make the process of conceptualizing how to get there? Or is that really not relevant because we know how to build it, we just have to be able to actually do it, and then we'll figure out to see what it's good for?
Yeah, I mean, we do know some things, right? We know it breaks RSA, so it scares the poop out of all the three-letter agencies,
Yeah.
right? So we sort of know that, and then there's just the original story that goes back to Feynman, which is quantum computers as a simulator of quantum physics.
Yeah.
And in some sense, you do sort of have to actually hash that out and see how that works, because it's unclear. It's not obvious that like maybe there are classical algorithms, right? And it is true that we have classical algorithms that in some places are very good for some of these things. So exactly where that boundary is kind of squishy. The bigger worry is sort of like, is that big enough, right? Like that's not a huge, that is an important tool, and it could lead to very interesting new science and new technologies. But it's kind of a weird tool in the sense of like, it can lead to companies that, end up doing breakthroughs in fields, right? But it doesn't necessarily, like, how do you value things like that? It's very different, right? We don't have a broad set of algorithms. We sort of have a lot of these, what people call polynomial speedups. And these are very challenging in our current way of building hardware to have practical impact. And so there's a lot of worry that we just don't have that larger thing. And so what's interesting is sort of what's happened in the last few years is we've seen people getting hands on small quantum computers. So they started thinking about these variational algorithms and sort of very practical minded, like, let's just push it and see if there's something there. And we still haven't seen as much sort of what I'd call the more abstract algorithm development. And that's just always been hard. That's sort of one of the things I worked on while I was at Caltech. And one of the reasons I worked on it was because like nobody was working on it. It got a reputation as really hard. People like Peter Shor and Manny Nill and all these very smart people had worked on it and not made much progress in the late 90s after Shor's algorithm. And so I kind of worked on it because I was like, well, like if I can make a small amount of progress, I can give convincing talks like, even if the idiot Dave can make progress, you should work on it too, right? Like, and we still don't have a ton of that, though. I'm starting to see again, partially because of so much money is being dumped in the field. I'm starting to see again some of that resurgence of really good people thinking hard about new algorithms. So who knows? Maybe we're about to enter. I'm right at the wrong time to say this. We're right at the time where we're going to actually start seeing major changes that we, have been waiting for. So.
From your perspective, where you are at Google, what is so difficult about quantum error correction? What's the challenge?
What's the challenge? Part of it is putting together a system that works where all of your, a lot of quantum computing has the form of, you'll see a press release, researchers come out with this great qubit that has a very long coherence time or something, right? Like, and they focus on one particular part of building the quantum computer. So, control of a particular gate, single qubit gate, or, doing a 2-qubit gate or leakage or things like this. But really you have to do all of those things at once. And so you have to make sure that all of the benefits you get in your individual experiments actually work when you're trying to build this larger system. And a lot of times that's, extremely challenging. So I'd say that's kind of what the field is dealing with right now is how to get the performance that they know they can get at the smallest scale and get it across, say, 100 qubits at once, right? And still maintain that so that you're low enough to do error correction. Then you have to coordinate and do it. So there are some like long-term challenges, like the error correction algorithms that you need to run are right now are not fast enough. For some, like the superconducting circuit ones, they're not fast enough because those are pretty fast quantum computers. For trapped ions, they might be better because they're slower quantum computers. And so those algorithms themselves in the, say, next 3 to 5 years need to be able to show that they can operate at that high enough speed. But I would say it's really this question of getting everything that you could do on a small scale to work at 100 qubit scale.
Dave, putting on your theoretical physicist hat, thinking about the potential impact of quantum computers for physics research itself, right? What are some of the exciting possibilities? Having a well-developed sense of all of the, the ongoing theoretical challenges in physics, where might quantum computers provide some insight?
I mean, one of the things that's kind of fascinating, I sort of left Google while they were doing a bunch of these experiments and then came back. But this team has had like a series of what they call sort of physics experiments where they're looking at, things like time crystals, out of order correlators, and these are all related to sort of simulating mini-body quantum systems. And if there's hope for the NISQ era right now, it's really that these, say 100 to 1,000 qubit machines will be an incredible simulator of all these questions in condensed matter physics that come up. And I do think that vision is like, we're right at the boundary of that. I can sort of see that happening. And the things that we're starting to get there, can we start to use it to gain insight into these physical systems? I'm always a little bit worried because quantum computing people often say things like, well, we'll use a quantum computer to simulate high temperature superconductivity, and then we'll get room temperature superconductors. There's like this giant leap in logic that occurs between those two statements. Not to say that I don't believe that like simulating it might help us understand theoretically better what's going on. I think it's still challenging to use a simulator to help you benefit your, sort of boost yourself up this level of what you can and can't do. But I do think that this sort of just simulation of these condensed matter systems is going to be fascinating. And again, here there's a place where like different architectures are very interesting. Neutral atom quantum computers look to be way better simulators because they get a lot of qubits together. And they don't have exactly the right control necessarily as easily, but they sort of naturally fit into the simulator system better. It is interesting also, maybe this is no longer true, but 5 or 6 years ago, it was true that Europe sort of pivoted very hard to thinking more about simulators than quantum computers. And then, Google and the other things sort of went up this other direction. I suspect that both are going to pay off, right? But there was sort of a division in some ways where it was sort of thought that only the industry places had enough sort of capability to do that scaling question. So they were trying to work in other places where they didn't have to deal with that. I think, my dream is always a room temperature superconductor, but I've always like, that's just one that I think is fascinating. And it's a curious one because people don't really work directly on it. You sound like a kook if you say, I want to work on room temperature superconductors. People are like, why? That doesn't exist. And you're like, well, yes, that's exactly right. And it kind of makes me bad about academia, where like that's what you should be thinking about, right? Like it's explicitly one of these like, why not, right? Like and so instead we justify it by like, oh, we do simulation and we'll understand it and then do it. And it's like, well, maybe we don't even need to understand it. We sort of have some big understanding, right? But I don't know. It's just that's a fascinating area to me.
Well, Dave, let's go back now to undergraduate days and get a sense of where your interests were circa 1993 when you got to Caltech. First, was it physics all the way? Was that what you came to Caltech for?
Yeah, so I caught the physics bug pretty early. I was also a computer. It was a hacker. I spent a lot of time running cellular automatas, neural networks, even back then. Sort of hacking, but a lot of it was for simulating things. I simulated physics. That was sort of one of the first things I did when I got a computer, and I didn't know trig at the time. So I did like a small angle, what was essentially a small angle approximation. I got these really weird orbits and I knew they were ellipses. And so then eventually I had to teach myself trig in order to figure that out. So I was sort of always on the boundary in some ways, but when I showed up at Caltech, it was very clear. Lots of people coming to Caltech, almost everyone takes physics 1, right? There are a few people who place out. My roommate was one of those, who's super genius, smart physics guy. But what was pretty clear is a lot of people come in and then you start taking physics and just like for some reason physics is harder. And like if you can do it, you should do it. And I remember the computer people had way more experience with like all these. I grew up in a very small rural area. Like I would go over the hill an hour away to go to the bookstore to sit and read the manual, right? To learn how to program the thing, right? Like that was sort of my access to knowledge. Whereas these people were, on the internet already and had vast knowledge of these things. And I was like, I don't think I can do that. So I literally took no straight computer science courses while I was at Caltech. I took a ton of computational neuroscience, which was really fascinating, especially at that time. Caltech was doing that. Hopfield was there, so I got Hopfield networks from Hopfield, which was pretty cool. But I pretty quickly realized I really loved physics and I was good enough at it to do it at Caltech's level, which is, doesn't always happen. A lot of people come in loving it, but it's just, physics for some reason has a lot of challenges. And so I sort of went that direction.
Dave, a generational question. So 40 or 50 years ago, physics was by far the dominant undergraduate major at Caltech. And to fast forward to today, computer sciences. So when you were an undergraduate, where were you in that broader transition?
So it was starting to transition more to electrical engineering and computer science. You could see that starting to occur. We hadn't been through the dot-com bubble yet, right? So we weren't sort of at that point. Physics still sort of, I had a lot of, physics, math, sort of the very hardcore sciences were still very much what a lot of people were, sort of fascinated by. So we were sort of right at I would say sort of at the beginning of that. It was, in some sense, it's hard not to be nostalgic about it in the sense of, back then being a computer nerd you were a nerd. Nobody really cared what you were doing, right? And so it would still had a very good feeling of community of nerds who are not, trying to do interesting things. And that definitely transitioned when the dot-com bubble came around, right? But when I entered, it was sort of the web was just sort of happening.
You're back.
I'm back. Sorry about that. Where did I leave?
The web was just starting to happen. Take two?
Sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened.
All good.
My computer may be overheating here. Speaking of the laws of physics,
there you go. It's getting nervous. All this talk about quantum computing on a classical computer.
Yeah, well, in computing, it's all physics fundamentally.
All right, so you were saying that as an undergraduate, it was still very nerdy. It was a tight-knit community of people who were interested in these things.
That's right.
Now, what kind of interaction did you have with John Preskill as an undergraduate?
So I really only had one interaction that I remember. I did a surf project, and it was in quantum computing. This is, you're at 96, 97, the summer of that. And I worked on, can quantum computers solve NP complete problems efficiently, which we don't think they can, but, at that time, be optimistic and try it. And I remember after the talk, he came up and my surf talk, and he came up and he said, "That was a hard problem you worked on," which is a kind of an understatement, right? If I had made progress on that, it would have, I would have been Peter Shor part 2. So I didn't have actually a ton. He had students that I knew who'd worked with him. I was a Tombrello person, so I worked on this Physics 11. I got into research very early at Caltech, which sort of was, for me, was a fascinating, that's what kept me at Caltech really strongly, is the learning there was this thing that was very different than the coursework that required you to creatively think about things. I sort of got sucked into that. And the other thing about that time, which I have to bring it up, which is just I lived in Ruddock House, and people would write in a lot of the dorms, they would write their names behind the mirror. And my neighbor, who I sort of was good friends with, one time we pulled off this mirror, we looked behind us, and we're like, "Oh, Peter Shor." And at the time, Shor had sort of just come up with this algorithm. I knew his name. I was super excited about it because I had discovered it always sort of quantum computing as it came out. I'd always sort of heard about it, knew about it very, very early. But there was this famous physics computation conference. And I printed out all the papers and read all of them because they were all physics and computation. So they were really fascinating. So I remember being super fascinated by that. And then I knew Peter Shor's algorithm. And I was like, oh, it's Peter's it must be Peter Shore for like, this has got to be the same guy. So when I first met him, I went up to him and I was like, Peter, have you ever written your name behind a mirror? And Peter's like the sweetest person. Peter's like, it's like, what is this random dude asking me this about? And it's like, I described, it's in Runnicowski's, but I'm like, oh yeah, that must have been me. And, it was indeed right there behind it. So that was like one of my early Caltech connections, which I always find fascinating.
So Dave, as you mentioned, it was clear that the term quantum computing was something you heard and you thought about as an undergraduate. Was your sense that quantum information was a field of study? Was that an area that you could think about, or that's really still too early in the game?
You could sort of think about it. I mean, I think one of the things that was occurring while I was an undergraduate that I didn't know a ton about was error correction. And so that research really was sort of ongoing, and John's group was in the middle of that. And his surf students worked on that. I remember they were looking at QDIC codes. But it was only to when I went to Berkeley for my PhD that I sort of realized that error correction was extremely important and sort of really demonstrated that quantum is not just analog computing. I would say most of us thought there was sort of an early generation of graduate students, Michael Nielsen, Chris Fuchs, people like that. And I associate with them and the group of IBM. IBM at the time, IBM was sort of the center of quantum information and quantum computing. But that was, as an undergraduate, I don't remember there really being an established thing of quantum information. I do, I definitely remember thinking about it as just quantum computation. And there's this whole tradition going back to foundations and Bell inequalities, which I'd always been sort of also deeply fascinated by and knew a ton about. So I sort of linked it up in my mind with that, right? Like this was coming out of this long tradition of people like saying, hey, quantum looks weird, right? So maybe it's not just weird, but useful, right? It was a pretty natural thing to ask, right? In retrospect, it seems silly that it took us so long to ask that question. But, it definitely, when you hear it, you'd be like, oh, of course that's true. Like, we know it's weird. That's what Bell's theorem says. It says it doesn't behave like the classical information processing. So that was my Caltech. And I did do, my cert was on quantum computing. It was with Nicholas Cerf and Chris Adami, who were two postdocs who, were under, what was the provost's name?
Steve Koonin.
Steve Koonin, yes, good old Steve Koonin, who I almost made the most embarrassing thing of my entire life. I showed up at Caltech. I'm a new kid straight from the sticks. I'm walking around campus, and I see this guy, this kind of short guy, talking to this very tall guy, and the short guy looks just like the guy from Honey, I Shrunk the Kids.
Rick Moranis.
Rick Moranis. And I'm like, I wonder if that's Rick Moranis. And I walked by and I didn't say anything, but I was like, I should ask for an autograph because I really did think it was him. And then later on, I realized that was Steve Koonin talking to Jeff Kimball, who was very, very famous Caltech professors. I was like, I'm glad I didn't interrupt their conversation. They were probably talking about something secret because I think they're both Jasons, right? So they're probably literally probably something national security related.
Now, as an undergraduate, Dave, did you have a sense in working with postdocs and seeing what the graduate students were doing? Did you have a sense that this was a research community that had a momentum that would build into what would become the IQI?
I certainly knew that John was at the middle of a lot of this. I mean, John's historical interest had to do with, the information paradox, and as he says, he didn't understand information, right? And so he needed to really try to understand it. And so that part of the story I sort of knew, and I don't know, I didn't know Michael Nielsen. I don't think I knew people from his group at that time. I think it was only when I went to Berkeley, and then when I went to Berkeley, he gave his first class in quantum information, and his notes were incredibly influential, right? For a lot of it. It was sort of like he's the physicist version of how you should learn. This is very much a physicist, and his notes are incredible. He has sort of these quantum field theory notes, which are also incredible, right? And that was definitely for me, a big transformation, getting a hold of those notes and learning them. But I don't remember sort of a momentum there. I just remember Caltech seemed like a great place to be doing this because it was one of these fields that sat on multiple disciplines, which Caltech traditionally has just been, that's like a defining characteristic is like, the physics faculty would show up and talk to the biologists and they'd be, have some crazy thing that would come out of that. And so for me, it felt very natural, but I don't remember sort of the momentum yet at that time.
When you started to thinking about graduate school programs, was it quantum information that you were specifically, you were not thinking about quantum information?
No, I mean, like all undergraduates at that time, you were groomed to do string theory or head in that direction, right? High energy physics of some form. I sort of, that was sort of, if you looked at my trajectory, that might be that's sort of like what maybe my essay said. But I got very interested in astrophysics, and so I applied sort of thinking that I wanted to go to a place that had very strong astronomy. And part of it was sort of the more, either cosmology or, this just, there are high energies out there in space, and we can maybe learn some fundamental physics by looking at those. So that sort of thing. And so when I went to Berkeley, I did, like, my first year was, I was lucky at Caltech. I took enough of the courses and graduate courses that I didn't have to take like the first year at Berkeley. So I just took all astrophysics. And then about a year after that was when I was like, there was a quantum computing researcher who was doing some things related to error correction. And I met with him and he sort of explained to me error correction. And for the first time, I really sort of understood why you would need it. And that's how I got sucked back into sort of the quantum computing. So it always been sort of there, but there wasn't a ton of, when I applied, it wasn't to go to quantum computing. I was going to do astrophysics. And then it just so happened that like the field started to exist. And so, and I looked around, I remember thinking like, oh, all these astronomers are super smart. They're working on problems they've been working on for decades, right? Like here's this new field. There aren't very many smart people in it. They're all smart, but it's new, right? Like I should work in the thing that's new because that's what research is, right? Like, and I definitely remember having that like discussion in my head and then being like, okay, this field looks like someplace where there's a lot of new problems. There's a lot of low hanging fruit to work on right now.
Who was the researcher that opened you up to the importance of quantum error correction?
So that was Daniel Ladar, who I used to call my postdoc because we worked really close together.
Yeah.
And we would work on ideas and then produce papers, and I had a great time. He was a postdoc of Birgitta Whaley, who still works in quantum computing and is a chemist, right? So moved over to the chemistry building, but still was a physics student. And Daniel was the one who really explained error correction to me. The one bad thing about Daniel is he changed his name. So right before I met him, his name used to be Hamburger. He was Israeli, and when he changed it when he moved to the US, we would have had papers that were bacon hamburger. Like it would have been epic. And in fact, he told me that if I came back, because I left quantum computing, if I came back, he would write a paper and he'd change his name back. But ever since he said that, I haven't had any conversation. Seems to have disappeared a little bit.
Now, what can we read into the fact that Whaley is a chemist interested in quantum computers?
Yeah, so I mean, she was a physical chemist, so a lot of her work is in sort of like simulating these systems, tight binding calculations. So sort of understood I think she definitely understood the power that like, oh, if we could simulate things, that was definitely one of her like would be obvious in some sense. But she was also she told me once she was always trying to get into a physics department. Right, she was sort of always on that boundary of like doing sort of more of the physicsy type side of the world, and she was a great advisor in the sense of she let people go in directions. Daniel sort of was the one who he had previously worked on inverse scattering problems, and then when he started working in quantum computing and got hired over, he sort of really did start that direction, and she was one of those good advisors to like, oh yeah, that's great, let's go that direction, right, and so I always felt like very lucky everybody needs a different type of advisor, but I think I needed one that was like, lets you go off and explore.
And was there anyone at Berkeley in physics or computer science that was thinking about quantum information?
So there wasn't really in physics. There's people a little bit on the periphery. It's some experimentalists, Dan Stamper-Kern. Over in the computer science, there was Umesh Vazirani, who wrote sort of one of the earliest rigorous definitions of what a quantum computer is, and showed this one of the first super polynomial speedups, one of the first speedups showing that quantum computers really do offer advantage. So he was over in the computer science department, and I had off and on, there wasn't a tight connection between those two groups, But there were definitely, seminars or talks or people that I met through that sort of connection. And as I was leaving, Scott Aronson was starting as a graduate student there, so I overlapped a little bit with Scott. And that was, of course, a fascinating time.
Now, were there any administrative challenges being a physics grad student with a chemist as your advisor?
A little bit. I mean, the same things that always happen. The funniest thing was after they did sort of like the one main sort of like presentation of your work. And I think I already had my offer from IQI to go become postdoc when I did this thing. But the committee chair, Eugene Cummins, has said to me afterwards, he's like, well, this is all good work, but we want to make sure you continue to do physics and don't do all this computer thing, right? And that was very much like, the old school traditional physicists of like, this is this newfangled computer thing, right? And I was going to do what I was going to do, right? Like, it didn't really have any influence. I kind of think about it as like a validation in the sense of like, oh, I'm doing something that he doesn't think is like a useful thing, whereas I'm like, computers are the future, dude. So there was just things. There was like a little bit of a push in that direction. But besides that, it was actually pretty seamless. Berkeley also was pretty good. The chemistry department there is excellent, right? So, and Berkeley is pretty good about not having too bad barriers between places. Again, I still think it's like one of the key things for good institutions is having low barriers between departments. So I didn't really get that. And there was Lawrence Berkeley Lab was up on the hill, so there was people always sort of, it was kind of assumed that you could do other things with other affiliations that you were doing. So I don't remember anything crazy like that. Besides that one comment, which I thought was actually just more humorous than.
What were the big research questions that defined your thesis research?
So my thesis research was on what people call decoherence-free subspaces and decoherence-free subsystems. And so I would say the main result in there is this discovery that you can quantum compute using just an exchange interaction. So this idea that usually you have single qubit gates and 2 qubit gates, and you have a universal set of operations you can do. But it turns out that if you just have this one interaction, the exchange interaction, you can do quantum computation by working in an encoded basis. And so that was not sort of previously known. And that still lives on today. HRL's effort in quantum computing uses exchange-based qubits. So you take 3 spins and build one encoded qubit out of it. And when you do that in that encoded space, you use just this exchange interaction to do your quantum computation. So this is, of course, very much like error correction, right? In the sense of you're encoding into a space and working on that encoded space. You take multiple qubits and then you work in an encoded space spread across those. The things we were working on were called decoherence-free subspaces, which meant that sometimes the interactions of your environment with your system during error correction, your errors have so much symmetry that they sort of conserved spaces that are not touched by that symmetry. So in the case of what we looked at is sort of like if every qubit interacts identically with coupling to some environment, then there are these subspaces that are preserved. They're decoherence free. And this, in practice, this has been actually seen. I actually, in that same thesis defense, I literally had, all the theory up to a point, and then there was one slide which was, the experiment. And actually, I don't remember if it was used. One of the physicists on the committee asked me like, well, this is all good in theory, but what about in practice? And literally, my next slide was this first demonstration of a decoherence-free subspace. So I kind of like lucked out on that. So the thesis was mostly about symmetry in quantum computers and how you can exploit it. For these decoherence-free subspaces, for building different error sort of encoded qubits. And then also the end of my thesis, which was the one that's kind of the most interesting, was about this idea of self-correction. Like, can you build quantum computers that are able to sort of correct their own errors? And this relates to the stuff that has a strong tie to Caltech, which is topological quantum computing. And I was sort of trying to build versions of that were sort of even more robust than the stuff that Kataev did, is the way to say it. I was trying to build like very, very robust quantum systems, self-correcting ones. And wasn't able to do it in that thesis, but I at least started laying here's a vision of that direction.
Dave,
So
20 years plus, what aspects in thinking about decoherence and quantum computers are resolved and what are as fresh as when you first started to confront these problems?
there's still a lot of fresh things. So for example, so one of the things that when I got to Caltech, I wrote a paper that ended up having a error correcting code that people later named after me, which is embarrassing. But that code, for example, was discovered back many years ago, right, 2001-ish, and only just recently, my friend Ken Brown and Calderbank discovered that if you look at the 4x4 version of that, it actually can have decoherence-free subspaces in it. This is literally literally my thesis and the thing I should have seen this, but nobody saw it, right? So error correction has a lot of stuff that I think will continue to happen like that, where we're just, it's the nature of research that you just always think you've solved the problems and you haven't. I do think fields get fossilized, right? So error correction did get a little bit when I got obsessed with threshold calculations, or the threshold was the number. So the threshold is this number about your error in your quantum computer. And basically, if your errors are below, there's not really one threshold. There's a lot of different thresholds, but usually people say threshold, and they say like the errors are below the threshold. And when that's true, then error correction works and makes things better. And if you're above threshold, like I said earlier, if you run the algorithm, it makes things worse, right? So the threshold is very important because you want it to be very high, right? You want to be able to tolerate as many errors as possible. Like if you could get 30% error for every cycle and you could tolerate that and do quantum computation, that'd be awesome. But so the field did get sort of obsessed with that number and sort of as thinking about that as the only thing. And I don't think that's true. I think there's, like any complex problem, there's a lot of different reasons that different error correcting codes and schemas will work in the real world. And so not just that number is actually important. I think that field has matured, but it's entering the new phase where they're actually having to do the error correction in the real world. And that's just going to change everything because, it's always theory until it's the real world. And then all of a sudden you realize there are things we didn't think of, things we didn't understand, different alternative approaches. And oftentimes they'll seem simple. They'll be like, oh, just do this, right? But that's those are the best, right? You're like, oh, it's just simple, yes, and nobody thought of it, and then now we have it, and now things are better.
Dave, even before you started to think about postdoc opportunities, did the creation of the IQI, did that register with you? Was that sort of a big deal in the field?
I remember, I do remember the IQI being founded. I do remember John. John also would always invite tons of people to go talk. Mm-hmm. I do think at the time, IBM was the center of theoretical. Charlie Bennett and David DiVincenzo, that group was considered the place to be for anything and John Smolin in quantum information. And there really was a very quantum information-y feel to a lot of that, even though some of it was quantum computation. There was a ton of stuff coming out of teleportation and measures of entanglement and things like that, but were very much centered with over there. But I do remember as a graduate student, I definitely visited Caltech multiple times. What I most remember was I visited Michael Nielsen, who was in the process, I think, of writing his textbook. And I think Michael explained to me the Schmidt decomposition. And I was like, oh, that's beautiful. I don't think I'd ever seen it before. And he explained that to me. And, getting to meet him, he's like one of the more fascinating people in quantum computing. And that had a big impact. And maybe I only visited once. I'm not sure. So there was another part of the story, which I think is why I knew more about Caltech's effort than anything else, which was there was a thing called the SQUIT network, Southwest Quantum Information Network. I don't remember what it was. It's got a weird acronym I always give. And this was started by, the primary people were Ivan Deutsch, Carl Caves, probably Ike Chuang at the time. And so those conferences, they started very on having conferences that were a mix across all experiment and all theory, and they intermingle all these talks. So it was very cross-disciplinary. And Caltech was definitely part of that. David Wineland in Colorado at Boulder was there. So every year they'd give a talk about the greatest experiment they'd done. it was a really key meeting point for graduate students at the time. And they had summer schools and things like that. And I think at least one of the squints was at Caltech, but I don't remember if that was while I was a postdoc or while I was a graduate student. So.
It's a different station in life when you came back to Caltech. What had changed both for you and for where quantum information was at Caltech?
It's awesome to come back because you're not a student anymore, so you can actually enjoy a lot more. So Caltech, the second time around was, there were two things. One is weird to be not an undergraduate at Caltech because Caltech undergraduates are so, sort of tight, they're all, it's a very strong community, right? And so I was no longer part of that community. I probably could have passed off as one and, had fun with the undergraduates, but, sort of different stage in your career. But you also weren't under the stress of just like constantly doing homework, right? Like, my Caltech experience was like, I loved it because that was sort of my goal was to go to a place that would make me understand where my limits were, and I found them. Right? It turns out like you can't take 4 physics classes at once at Caltech. It's not possible. Your brain explodes and you don't have enough time in the day to do the problems. But as coming back as a postdoc was great because you're now sort of part of this amazing community. I spent a lot of time while I was there. I would do what I call television watching, which is instead of watching television, I would just choose a random seminar from some other field I didn't know and go to it. And mostly, like, if you go to like the synthetic chemistry ones, it'd be like, I have no clue what any of these words are, right? Like the jargon was too high. But a lot of them, like I remember going and learning about like simulating the dynamo in the Earth. It turns out you do this by taking molten liquid sodium and putting it into a big sphere and putting a propeller in there and spinning it around and seeing if it generates a magnetic field. You're like, whoa, that's crazy, right? So it was awesome to be back as part of just more as the good parts about Caltech. There's lots of crazy, interesting science going on. By that time, when I started, there weren't we didn't have a ton of postdocs. I think Katayev had moved to Caltech. I don't remember the exact date he was there. He was my neighbor, Sean Halgren, and I shared an office. And that was like, the thing that was incredible when you showed up at the IQI is John literally started inviting everybody in the field to come visit. And so there was just this like train of people. I really, a lot of postdocs end up spending a ton of time on the road, traveling, giving talks and doing that. And in some sense, that's good for your career, right? Like that's a great, it's sort of part of your getting out there into the academic field. But I kind of got spoiled in that I didn't have to travel very much because it all just came right through the door, right? And that was like incredibly, in retrospect, I don't know, like now having seen a lot of things, there aren't a lot of places that achieve that, right? Like, so KITP brings in a lot of programs. It's like on that level where you just get these huge groups, but it was like all of quantum computing was flowing through that place. And I was in the like main place where we would have the group meetings. I was in that thing. And so like literally it felt like, everybody come in and they give their talk right outside my office. This is perfect.
And Dave, what were the big ideas that were animating IQI in the early years?
So definitely topological quantum computing was always a big one. In general, that one sort of, and error correction in general. So, there was sort of, when I look back, there was sort of the Daniel Gottesman era. He wrote very important, influential thesis on error correction and sort of that history of really deeply understanding, error correction, what it can and can't do. And then these questions about like building naturally resilient systems, which is originally sort of Katayev's main contribution. It's sort of like, hey, these anion systems seem to have protected, they can be used to quantum compute and it seems to be protected. And so there was a lot of interest in that. I would say in general, there was just a lot of people were sort of allowed to go in their own directions. As a postdoc, I don't remember having any conversation with John about what I should work on at all, actually, like, except to the extent of like you talk to him about what you were working on and he'd say, oh, maybe think about this or, sort of that type of thing. It was not prescriptive at all. We were all given a lot of freedom to do things. A great example of this was Guy Vidal, who was a postdoc as well. Guy had done a bunch of important early work. And one day he came in and he gave his group meeting where it was kind of hilarious. He started off and he said, "So I have been working on quantum entanglement." And it's like, well, and then I thought, why am I working on quantum entanglement? And he's like, well, I realized I'm working on quantum entanglement because my advisor, who was very smart, worked on quantum entanglement. And then he's like, that does not seem like a good reason. I'm like, yeah, that's not a good reason, is it? And then his story was, well, then I thought, like, why would you study entanglement? What use can we do it? And then he proceeded to describe this idea about the relationship between how much entanglement system has and how hard it is to simulate. And this is eventually turns into sort of tensor networks. He basically rediscovered matrix product states and DMRG, and not DMRG, the renormalized, I'll butcher the names, so I'm not going to say it. He basically rediscovered methods that had been known before, but recast them in a way that was totally novel. And so there were things like that just occurred. And then now people, of course, people got very interested. It's like, oh, here's this new tool, tensor networks, that we can use in all these different amazing ways. And that animated a lot of us because we're like, oh, that's pretty crazy and interesting. So a lot of stuff that I remember from that time was stuff that sort of was just coming out of the air from wherever research stuff comes from, right?
And were there, I mean, in terms of the exuberance at the time, and maybe even some of the naivete, were people thinking at that point that this jumble of theories was going to lead to an actual quantum computer? Or was that sort of way too far afield, thinking about the engineering and the condensed matter side of things?
Yeah, I think in many ways, at Caltech, it was very pure research of just trying to understand these things. Really error correction, I call error correction the shield in quantum computing, right? It's what happens is you go talk, in that era in particular, you go talk to some group in some physics lab, and they would sort of have a conversation with you, and they'd be skeptical about quantum computing, right? It's not possible, right? And then you'd sort of probe and ask why they thought that. And sometimes they had, reasonably good answers, and most of the times they didn't. But then you'd also probe them about whether they knew error correction or not. And if they didn't know error correction, usually people at quantum, we just sort of like start ignoring people like that, because it really is like a transformation of your worldview, like this idea that you can take these noisy components and put them together to build a robust, machine. That's like an amazing insight. And so a lot of it wasn't really focused on like how long or how hard it's going to be. It's just trying to convince people that it was possible at all. And for many years, the story of error correction didn't really, people didn't know it. And so like there was this huge gap in understanding of like why a bunch of us are optimistic on, maybe a 20 or 50 year time scale. And so I would say we weren't really in the depths of like, can we do it? There were parts of IQI, right? Jeff Kimball had been doing, cavity QED type stuff. There were definitely there were always experimental people coming through and talking. A lot of that got mixed up with the Squint network, which had a very good view of that. So most of us would go to the Squint as well, and that would help us sort of see the experiment. But we weren't sort of like obsessed with building or thinking about that part. We were just like, there's a bunch of really hard, interesting problems here. Let's work on them.
And what was the research culture like? Was it postdocs working with postdocs? Where were the interactions with the professors and the graduate students? How did all of that work together?
So it was a lot of postdocs working with postdocs working with visitors, graduate students working with postdocs. So I worked with Ben Toner on some very foundation questions. So a lot of I would say the research culture was shaped by the sort of infamous group meetings that John would have that would last a very long time. And he would come in and he would sit. He had his nice comfy chair. My office was right behind him. So I would sit behind John. I had the best seat because I didn't really have to pay attention because he couldn't look back to see. He really had to turn to like see me. And at the time, John's a huge baseball fan. At the time, Barry Bonds was clobbering homers and things like this. So my job was often to go in and report on the scores from the baseball games that were occurring on, because that was, of course, like John's. I think just recently I saw that somebody asked him what career he would take if it wasn't. It was like Saberischen or whatever the stats for baseball.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
I think that's like his. If he could live his dream job, it would be that, right? But that group meeting had just this amazing culture of everybody would go around, usually if they had something that they were working on, talk about it, right? And sometimes this was pretty bad because there were a couple of people, myself and Andrew Landau, who's now at Sandia in New Mexico. Like if we got the pen early, we would talk a long time, and then every graduate student, or he was a graduate student at the time, but like everybody afterward would feel obliged to say a lot. And these meetings would just go on for a long time, but they were really, part of it was keeping John up to date. Part of it was just sharing the knowledge, but they were like incredibly, there was, what's interesting is I'd be interested to hear the graduate students. As postdocs, I never felt pressure. I just felt like if I had something interesting to share, I would share it, and then I would get critiqued, or we would, somebody afterwards would get very interested in it. And of course, we also had people like Katayev there. So, Katayev wouldn't come every time, but then he'd come, and every once in a while, Katayev would just rip off one of these, like, well, I have been thinking about quantum gravity, and then he would describe some amazing new thing that, like, people were like, where did that come from? So,
where do you see any intellectual links between your work and decoherence in graduate school and what you were doing at the IQI?
Well, so the decoherence stuff one of the things that did happen is I was working on these what are called subsystem codes. And these are different types of codes. And it turned out that I was sort of, in my thesis, I had found a code which was very interesting. I didn't really know how to describe it as an error correcting code. While I was at Caltech, people sort of realized that these subsystem codes could be used as error correcting codes, but they didn't have good examples of them. And I sort of had this example in my thesis that I knew sort of explicitly was one of these codes, right? So it was very much, the decoherence free stuff was all about symmetries, but the error correcting stuff was very similar in nature. So there was a very sort of natural overlap there. And then it was true that I was just trying to think about how to build physical systems that were error correcting, and that's like topological quantum computing. And what I was trying to do was build versions of this which are stronger than that. And John had written a paper while I was in grad school about the 4-dimensional toric code. So if you had 4 space-time dimensions, it turns out quantum computing would be way easier. Or in the sense of like there's a physical system that exists in four spatial dimensions that it preserves quantum information extremely robustly at sort of a temperature much higher than the energy gap of your system. So sort of like the way to think about it in some ways is it's sort of like when you store information in a classical system in like magnetic domains, you have a bunch of spins pointing up or down. And if you flip a spin, the neighbors sort of feel that it's oriented wrong and it costs some energy to do that. And if you do this in one dimension, it's not very good, because if you flip a spin, it only has 2 neighbors. And they sort of like, oh, that's okay, it only costs a little bit of energy. You can flip the next one, and it only costs a little bit to do it. It doesn't have an amount of energy that scales like a perimeter. And so in one dimension, you can't really store classical information very well. You can, but it's really challenging. And the same thing's true in quantum, but it turns out that in quantum, you just have to double everything. So instead of 1 versus 2 dimensions, it's 2 where it's hard but possible, like the toric code, and 4 where it's easy. And we were really trying to find systems in lower dimensional spaces that did this. So could we get it to work in 3D? And we still don't know the answer to this. We actually, there's actually been kind of fascinating codes that people discovered that are somewhat work in 3 dimensions, is the right way to say it. But it's still sort of a big open question in the field.
Dave, I'll ask a question about the job market at this time that will tie together several of your affiliations after that, the Santa Fe Institute, University of Washington, in several roles. Were you thinking about tenure-track faculty positions, but quantum information was just so far out there that it wasn't really yet a field that institutes were hiring in? Yeah,
it was brutal. We used to always joke that, Daniel Gottesman, who ended up going to the Perimeter Institute, we called him the canary, because he had written, a thesis that was, very transformational. Like, this is incredible work as a graduate student, right? And and he was a physicist in the sense he was trying to get jobs in physics departments. So it was very like all of us, all the postdocs who were there were trying very hard to get good jobs and, having a lot of struggle. Some of it, there was strong connections back to Europe where there was better job market, I think, but it was still not particularly great. The Perimeter Institute and Waterloo had started by the time I was sort of looking at that. So it was sort of like, oh, you could get a job up in the cold, frigid Northwest. And some of my friends, did that. Debbie Leung, who's still there. She still complains about the temperature every May when it's like super cold in Waterloo. And she's like, it's May, why is it snowing? But it was pretty brutal. And part of it was, again, this underlying skepticism about quantum computing, because in some ways, quantum computing does tie back to foundations questions, right? You're sort of taught, don't worry about quantum mechanics, it works, right? And it was really hard to convince people, like, yes, it works, and there are these implications, right? And so there was a very deep sort of skepticism when you go talk to physics departments, which is where I was looking for jobs mostly, about quantum computing as a viable, they were very much, it's not a viable thing, it'll never happen. And, we would joke, people would say things like, quantum computing is just about two-level systems, right? And we'd get that comment from string theorists and people like that. So we're still also, it was a big string theory boom at the time, right? So that was still very popular and get a lot of jobs. And they were very dismissive of quantum computing. And of course that shifted over the years, right? Thanks in part to John and Patrick Hayden, who was one of the postdocs there, who really went off in this direction. And now quantum computing is one of the hottest places in sort of the more theoretical, minded part of the world for high energy physics, right? And so that shift's been awesome to watch, because it's kind of like, we told you so, just a couple of decades ago, you guys were so dismissive, but the job market was really brutal.
And what was happening at the Santa Fe Institute at that point? Was anybody doing quantum information there?
So Chris Moore was there, which is, I'm sure, I mean, there's it's kind of fascinating. So the story about error correction actually goes back a long ways. Of course, like Claude Shannon is involved in it, but also von Neumann. And in fact, von Neumann wrote a very famous, while he was visiting Caltech, von Neumann liked to drive. One of the things he did is he would drive out to Los Alamos from Princeton, right, which is nuts, right? But apparently he also went out to California, and he was at Caltech, and he wrote a set of lecture notes. I think actually they were maybe done after he passed away, they were published. But these notes are basically about how to do fault-tolerant classical computing. It's basically like the classical story of this. So this question about how to deal with noise and build resilient systems has had always a tradition at the Santa Fe Institute, which was a place that was looking at complexity, but also, like early cellular automata work and thinking about robustly storing information in physical systems. So I think that appealed when I applied to them. Like that was like sort of why they're like, why it was more interesting. And then Chris I was working at the time on hidden subgroup problems algorithms. So I had like a real natural, like internal advocate for me. He wasn't my official mentor. My official mentor was actually Murray Gilman, which was kind of fascinating, right? And I loved being at the Santa Fe Institute because I got to listen to Murray tell stories, which was like, kind of like listening to Feynman tell stories, right? Like, he was there and he had a story about everything.
Did you hear stories about his frustrations with Caltech at that point?
Oh, yeah, definitely. And I told him this once. So while I was at Caltech, like I said, I was a Tombrello kid. And Tombrello had given me a book about complexity and the Santa Fe Institute. So I think, my uncle lived in Santa Fe, so I knew about all this work and artificial life. So I was very much in that sort of like, very fascinated by that. But the funny thing is I knew that he had sort of left Caltech and was not particularly happy. And so his parking space was always empty at Caltech. So I would park my beater car at his spot because it was right beside Tombrello's office. And I never got called on it. I told him that once. He was not particularly happy with me. I don't think he ever used it or anything. But I was like, I've been using your parking spot because I know you're not around.
Now, I know Gell-Mann was famously dismissive of areas of physics that he did not consider quote unquote real physics, right?
Yeah.
Did you ever engage with him on quantum information and what he thought about that?
I did, and he had sort of his own sort of interpretation of quantum mechanics, which he would strongly advocate for. And so with him, the goal was always to agree with him about that. But he definitely, he wasn't skeptical of quantum computing. I never got any feeling of he was skeptical about it. I think if I had told him that Feynman invented the field, maybe it would have set him off. But he's sort of, I think he because his work was very much at the intersection of thinking about information and how it flows in physical systems. I think for him, it was actually kind of a natural thing. And I suspect a younger Murray would have actually been in the field pushing on it, right? He definitely was sort of that mind. The other great story from the Santa Fe Institute was Cormac McCarthy, is that the right name? Who was the author in residence, was literally my neighbor. And the great thing about Cormac is that he's a good friend of Murray, and so he actually knows a ton of physics, right? His novels are these very, kind of brutal, dark in many ways stories. He's a very sweet man. And I remember a conversation once where we were talking with somebody about Bell inequalities, and the guy didn't understand Bell inequalities. Fundamentally, he didn't understand there's a difference between classical correlation and these quantum correlations. He sort of had missed the main point. And so he was trying to, the guy was sort of giving me this thing about it's just this, and he kept going, and Cormac was there listening to me, and I just sort of was patiently letting the person go on, and then sort of at the end sort of said, no, actually what it means is this, right? Afterwards, Cormac came up to me and he's like, can't believe you let that guy sit there and say all that. He did not understand Bell inequality. I was like, oh my God, Cormac understands Bell inequalities. That's definitely a Santa Fe Institute thing. This amazing novelist also has a deeper understanding than probably 99.99% of the world about this foundational quantum phenomenon.
Dave, the series of positions at the University of Washington, was your sense that there were people there who were pushing for quantum information to get bigger, and you were sort of first in, but there was no real larger emphasis at the institutional level?
Yeah. So what happened is right before I went to the Santa Fe Institute, my father passed away, and it became increasingly clear that I needed to get closer to my mom. And so I started looking for, pretty soon after I started, positions at least on the West Coast. And so I tracked down Mark Oskin. I collaborated and worked with Ike Chuang, and Ike had worked with Mark. And Mark's a computer architect, and he'd sort of done some very early, again, way before it should have been done, work on how are you actually going to architect these things? What does a computer architecture look like for a quantum computer? So Mark was very interested in quantum computing, and he sort of he was able to scrounge up some money to get a scientist position. And then I applied for grants, and I got the grants, and so then I became research faculty. The really fascinating thing about that time was there was essentially no junior faculty in the U.S. Sean Hallgren, I think, was the only other person who, in theory, doing especially algorithms. But there were just because nobody was getting jobs. A lot of people were going to Canada or to Europe, right? Because of that, it turned out that getting grants was actually pretty easy because there was a bunch of tenured people who, and then there'd be a couple junior people. And so it'd be clearly we're getting a benefit because you were junior, right? And so, it actually wasn't hard to raise money for the years I was at UW. And it was just challenging to convince them that, I should be tenure track and quantum computing was something they should invest in. It just seemed so far out in the future, especially in computer science where literally Google is exploding, there's all these other fascinating things going on that are so short term, right? Why would we think about quantum, which is clearly decades away? I think they regret that a little bit now, but
Now at UW, I assume the approach was in the computer science program, they were wondering why you were not in physics, and in physics, they were wondering, well, this is computer science.
Yeah, that's right. You were in that. And it's a valid critique, actually. Actually, there's a lecture. I've never been able to track it down by Feynman. that he gave. I think it was the University of Chicago, where he talks about like the danger of cross-disciplinary work. And he's like, there's a biophysicist, and you give a talk to the biologist, and they're like, oh, that person knows so much physics. And you go over to the physicist, and the reverse happens, right? They're like, oh, they know so much biology. He's like, you can really get into this problem that like there's nothing actually deep or interesting about it, but it appears to each side like they're doing great at the other field, right? So I do think there's actually some truth to that, and I think it's a valid worry. I think there was just a lot of skepticism when I would talk to the physicist about quantum computing. And then, of course, you always have, in these conversations, when you really are honest and think about it, you have the questions about, like, am I a star? Am I the top person, right? Like, that's clearly what they're looking for, right? And, frankly, the computer science department at UW is better than the physics department, right? And so, like, it was a tougher challenge to climb in that sense. I actually have no regrets about those times. It was fun. It was a great faculty to work with. So
being in Seattle, were you tracking what was going on at places like Amazon or Microsoft? Were they starting to get involved in quantum computing at this point?
So Microsoft had a sort of long tradition starting with Michael Friedman, and then Krista Savore, who was I think we were probably graduate students nearish the same time. Maybe she was a little bit younger than I am when she switched over. And so then there was sort of a group at Microsoft. So it was sort of definitely Microsoft was going on. Amazon wasn't doing anything. At one time I looked on LinkedIn, I remember there was one other person, Oliver Downs, who had quantum computing on their profile in all of the Seattle area. He had done some early patent work for D-Wave. And that was basically it. There was nothing. Beyond that. I definitely at the time also ran a quantum beer night. So throughout my history, starting in Berkeley, we started a quantum beer night, and that was essentially Brigitte Whaley, some of the graduate students, Ken Brown, who's now a professor at Duke. That was sort of the core of it. And then when I went to Caltech, we turned it into quantum margarita night. And we go to Amigos, not eat the food, and just have margaritas. And then we had it back in Seattle, and then it started up again when I returned to quantum computing here. So that's always been my one social outlet for it's like bring beer night wherever I go.
Dave, would you visit the IQI during the UW years? Were you staying on top of what was going on there?
I'm sure I did. I do remember going to a conference. Actually, it may have been, maybe this was late, right before I left for Google. I remember going to a conference down at Caltech. Maybe it was John's birthday party. I'm trying to remember. It could have been that, because I remember talking to people about leaving. People like, you're crazy, why are you leaving? I remember talking to David Poulin, who was passed away, who was a Caltech postdoc as well. And I remember David said to me, he's like, you really don't understand that, like, you actually do good work. And I'm like, well, thank you, David. That's like the nicest thing you've ever said. But he's like, you have imposter syndrome. I'm like, yeah, I know I do, but I'm going to go try something else. He's like, you're crazy.
What were your interests during the UW years? What were you working on, say, like 2005 to 2010?
So again, still thinking about error correction. I really got deeply involved in this hidden subgroup problem, which is Shor's algorithm. Works because you can find the period of a function efficiently, and that means that your function has a symmetry, it's periodic, and there's an extension of that. And so for many years we were trying to understand, like, when can quantum computers actually solve that? So one of the things I was working on was actually finding places where we had groups which are non-abelian, so not as simple in some ways, that we could solve it, and trying to understand why that was. So I worked a lot on that. And then again, a lot of it was on physical ideas for error correction, trying to really, coming up with weird techniques for trying to build quantum computers, and discovering weird codes along the way. There's sort of a code that we found from thinking about, like, this code has a very weird origin, because it originally comes from a paper. There's a book called Mathematicians in Love by Rudy Recker, which is a really weird psychedelic. He always writes sort of like pseudo psychedelic sciencey stuff. And I read the book and I was like, oh, this gives me a great idea. And I called up Ken Brown, who was at Georgia Tech, and I was like, here's an idea from this book. You should read the book. And he read the book. He's like, you really did get that idea from the book. And we wrote a paper on, like, these weird ways of building codes in classical systems at finite temperature. And like that led into this other type of code that has a similar property. So I was thinking a lot about weird codes that might have interesting properties. So those are sort of the main directions, I would say.
Did quantum computers, to contrast to what you said earlier about how during your time as a postdoc at Caltech, it was all really fundamental theory stuff. Looking 5, 7, 10 years down the line, did you get a sense that things were progressing so that a scalable quantum computer became more of a realistic proposition?
I would say when you were in the field, it was hard to see the progress. The early days in the sort of 2000s, when going to Squint, you would see these talks by Dave Wyman's group in trapped ions, and each one they'd be building larger computations that seemed to be growing and getting larger. But there was definitely sort of about the time I was leaving, it did not feel like progress was being made at a rapid pace. And I think that's partially when you're in a field, it's just incredibly hard to see progress.
Yeah.
Right. And so I do have this benefit that I left and came back. And so you just get a better appreciation of the 5 to 10 year,
sure.
That 5-year time scale, which we have a hard time comprehending for some reason. And the progress happens on that scale, not on 1 year. Right. And you can really see it. But I don't remember thinking like, oh, we're on a great scale. There was a very famous roadmap that was put together by a bunch of smart people. And you go back and read it, and it's hilarious. It's, basically we will have an error-corrected qubit in, 2 years or something like that. And, super optimistic, but not realistic at all. And so whenever I hear people complain about like quantum hype today, I'm like, there's always been this optimism because we're all optimists. But very smart people have said really silly things about how fast this will occur. It's probably going to occur today. Very smart people are going to say silly things, and that's okay because that's just us being optimists. Now there's hype, which is really bad and can be like overdone, right, when you're selling things. But on the other hand, this like optimism will always be there.
Dave, how did the opportunity at Google come about in 2011?
So part of the story is I started working on a collaboration with the people who eventually founded IonQ, Jun-Sang Kim and Chris Monroe. And part of that was to do architecture design for their modular system. So it was like, let's think about the computer architecture type problems there, as well as like the hardware development effort to try to build these things. And as part of that, I got on a plane I went to a conference in Australia, the Coogee conference, and I got on a plane and I was going to write some code to start building tools to simulate this. And it's like a 14-hour flight. So I had like 3 batteries because this was back in the era when there wasn't any, like not enough juice in your laptop. And I just wrote Python code. And then on the way back, I did the same thing. And it kind of occurred to me, it was like, I really liked that, right? I really enjoyed writing code. I built a website called Scirate, which is, it's like an overlay on the archive where people can like cite papers. And when I left academia, I shut it down, but people actually rewrote it twice, actually, and it still exists. And it's actually almost exclusively used by quantum computing people. So it's actually a great thing for the quantum community because I can now just go and look at what do I think are popular papers. You just go look at that, and like over a month, you get like, these are the papers that everybody thinks were the best papers of the last month, right? Which, as a not full-time researcher, is a great tool. So I had written that. I wrote some iPhone apps. I wrote an iPhone app that was an overlay over the archive for downloading papers and saving them. And then I wrote one which was a random number generator. And this was the very beginning of iPhone stuff. So my big thing was you could take your iPhone and shake it, and it had one of those spinny animations, and it would generate a random number. And it turned out the people who loved that were teachers because they would put their students' names in there and shake it. And the students, when they were like calling on students, and the students loved that, right? This was so novel at the time, right? So I'd done all these little projects, and then I was just like, I should apply to, and I also in the CS department at UW, I looked around and I thought, where are people going on their sabbaticals? And they were like all going to Google at the time. And so I was like, that's a sign. This is a good company. There must be fascinating things to work on. So I just woke up and I studied. I took an algorithm design manual. I read all the algorithms. I didn't do enough coding. So I basically bombed the coding parts of the interviews at Google. And I just applied and somehow got an offer. I was like, okay, well, we'll try it.
And Dave, was this explicitly a quantum
No.
information opportunity?
No, totally just a software engineer. When I showed up, so they sort of, Google would always hire generalists and then they try to place you. When they tried to place me, they basically just had me tour all the former professors who were at the Google Seattle office. And they were doing more researchy type work, I would say. And I actually chose none of them. I wanted to go somewhere where I could learn to be a real programmer, is the way I call it, right, with quotes around it.
Did you think you
And
were
so
leaving? Did you think you were leaving the field to some degree?
yes, very much. In the sense of like, I still, while I was at Google, I still worked on research problems on my own, right? So I still worked on graph isomorphism and thinking about that. So I still to the day I die, I'll be thinking about random problems like this, right? It's just not, that's in my core being. So, and it just became a hobby, right? Not a full-time thing, but it was totally a transition to a totally different career, right? And that was hard because you're no longer a professor, you're no longer all that expertise, it doesn't matter anymore. What matters is, can you build the system that, is going to sell the product?
So the extension to Google getting involved in quantum information stuff, this is total serendipity. You do not see this long-term strategy.
No, I mean, not at all.
Wow.
And in fact, I left. I helped build Google Domains, which is a domain registrar, and then I started working on federated learning, distributed machine learning, privacy-preserving machine learning, and Google, like I said, had some early efforts, and I had sort of helped connect them with people because I'd sort of watched from the periphery for a long time. Even when they started, because I was sort of like, I just had this other career. I was doing all these other things. And then eventually, it was just, kind of that they finally really did need software engineers to build parts of their system. And so, I want to say it's seven-dimensional chess, but it was just more of like choosing a company that might somehow do quantum computing, right? Is sort of the luck, right? So
was Google's operations in Seattle, was it sort of predetermined to be alive to sort of future thinking in the field? Would that have been the place within the larger Google infrastructure that would have caught on to the quantum information revolution?
So the Seattle office itself, I was working in research, and there were some people who were doing stuff there, but it wasn't quantum. The quantum stuff really did originate from Hartmut Neven, he had worked in computer vision. He's one of the original people for Google Glass. So he had sort of sold a company to Google. He was down in the LA office, and really at Google, a lot of efforts that are far-reaching really come from directors or very senior people sort of just deciding, this is something Google should be doing and we should be pushing on it. And like the key at Google is always like, you don't want to get too big too fast. You don't want a VP to know what you're doing really until you've done it, right? And so Hartmut sort of was at the right level where he could sort of start a program and keep it small and sort of build it up and start to gain the expertise in the quantum world. But it was always a real risk within the company of like, why would Google be doing this, right? Do we have enough support from this? Luckily, there's some good reasons. The sort of, like a lot of these companies, especially in the early days of Google, what mattered the most was Larry and Sergey, right? What they thought. And it turns out that Sergey had actually gone and talked to Ike Twong at Stanford when he was looking for graduate student projects. And Ike, I think, gave him a project and never saw him again. And like a couple of months later or whatever, that's when they started working on PageRank. So like, and I think somebody asked him at one point, like, why did you do that? And Sergey said something of, well, I looked at quantum computing and it just seemed too hard to build right now. Like, which is a good answer in like sort of the era, 1990s when he was doing this, right? Like that was like a great answer to not go in the fields. Like, I don't think it's practical yet, right? And because of errors, right? So he didn't say it because it was not a bad model. He's like, because of error correction, how hard it is. It's like, oh, that's pretty good. So fundamentally, I think Sergey has always been a huge supporter of quantum computing, and so that helps, right? So Hartmut had an ally who's sort of like, support him, and now we're at a point where the team has done this major milestone beyond classical computation. So there's a lot of internal support now because that's seen as like a very good press, but also just a new step in the quantum computing era, right? So
Do you have a specific memory of when and why Google jumped into quantum when it did?
Um, no, I mean, the early stuff was they really did try to want to understand whether D Wave's machine gave any advantage, and they developed a lot of expertise in optimization, and so they were really investing in that. Hartmut Nevin is a very what the interesting thing is, I also sort of watched him when he started. He was new to quantum computing, and I sort of watched him learn the field and became sort of a first-rate researcher in it, which like it's kind of crazy to be a director doing all this other stuff and then you're like actually mastering a pretty challenging field. So he was always just very, I think he fundamentally believes that this is a new field that we need to be on top of. For the main story is like if it gives any advantage for optimization or artificial intelligence, then Google should be doing it. But the real big transition was in this decision to hire John Martinez. That was definitely a transformative event because that was a transition. And what's interesting is the early days of that really were about building a D-Wave-like machine. And then John Martinez clearly kind of pivoted back to the more traditional approach. But it was really clear that they had done, there was this experiment where they'd done sort of classical error correction, shown thresholds, showed things that were just like below the threshold for error correction. So in some sense, that was it's a pretty clear mark where it's like, oh, this technology in the individual components look like they're good enough now. Now we just need to put it together. And that sounds like a Google thing to do. It's like, now we engineer it, right? And so in a lot of sense, that a lot of things that made a lot of sense. And built on a lot of hard work within the field, right? The invention of this transmon qubit was a huge change in how people built superconducting circuits. So there were these like events that occurred that really were like, without them, we would not be here, type of things.
And Dave, what did this transition mean for you? In other words, were you holding up a big sign that said, "Hey, I'm a quantum guy. I'm already here. This is perfect"?
Yeah, no, I mean, like I said, I'd always kept in contact with Hartmut. And what they really wanted to do is build a quantum computing service, right? So people can access the machine from the outside. And that's sort of a very normal computer engineering type things to do. So I just happened to be the right sort of person for that. I still, in many ways, quantum computing is still my home. So I have huge numbers of friends and people who, both I care about them and they care about me, who've been through all the experiences of this challenge of being an outsider field. So I was still very deeply coupled to the field in the sense of like I have a reputation. And so Hartmut was just very excited because it is hard to find, and still true today, extremely hard to find people who know how to build and engineer software systems and also can do quantum computing and quantum physics, right? Like that's not normal background for most people. Right. And so I think Hartmut was super excited because that was I had both of those and he was, willing to have me stay in Seattle, which was my one condition. And so, I was basically remote working on this and, I really did just luck out. But I do think having multiple superpowers is like a key thing for the new era, right? Where like it's really hard to find people who can both build good software and will be able to tell you about basic quantum computing, deeply understand the algorithms and all the theory behind it.
Dave, moving closer to the present, tell me about your decision to join IonQ. Did you leave Google or was it a leave of absence or how did that work?
So I officially left Google. It wasn't because I didn't like the Google team. I actually really liked the Google team. I'm back, right? So like it kind of shows it. But I had known Jungsang Kim and Chris Monroe from my previous work with them. An advisor on that team is Ken Brown, who's one of my good friends. He is currently professor at Duke, and he's one of those people. We were graduates, so founders of Quantum Beer Night include Ken Brown, and so they had tried to recruit me about a year before I left the first time, and it's just hard to figure out how to make that work financially for startups, right? Because you're like, I'm taking a big risk. And then when they approached me the second time, they were clearly about ready to go public and do this reverse merger, and I would get to participate in that. So a lot of the motivation was to sort of see that process and see, also frankly to see another quantum computer, right? And so IonQ has built another quantum computer, right, with another quantum operating system and all different challenges than the superconducting world, right? So it's sort of like, I knew I would grow by sort of seeing that new system. And so Google had invested in IonQ. And so in some sense, I always told Hartmut, like, I'm not, I'm helping Google Alphabet make a bunch of money, right? And so I really was there sort of to participate in that and see that through. And so it was definitely a fascinating experience to see, like, what do investors think about quantum computing? Why are they investing now, right? And have those conversations to try to understand where they are and what they're thinking about. So that was the IonQ adventure.
Now, IonQ had gone public already before you joined?
It basically, when they approached me, they're like, we were thinking about doing this reverse merger, the SPAC, right? And, we want you to join our team to be part of that. And, part of it is they were, Chris Monroe is, Nobel Prize worthy trapped ion quantum computer person, right? Like, he literally did most of the firsts in quantum computing, or the bests for many years, right? And Jungsang is much more of an engineer and comes from that background. And they didn't really have a theory or people connected to error correction or anything like that, or software, right? And so I sort of was used as that for their pitching this. Right now we have somebody who does these things. The team is mostly, a lot of it comes from Chris Monroe's and Jungsang's labs, so they're very tightly coupled to that. And so they have a very interesting technology, and I was sort of brought in as like the, software person plus helping them do theory, and then, sort of do the dog and pony show to talk about why trapped ions are not totally crazy.
What did you learn about quantum computing in the sense that in the world of investing, in the world of hype, there's a lack of patience, or maybe there's an expectation that might not really align with where either the theories or the experiments are in quantum information?
Yeah, I think so. The interesting thing is you talk to, when you do a SPAC, there's a company that's formed that has some amount of money. They're trying to do a merger with you, but you also, as a part of this, raise money in a pipe. So private investors, right, who are coming in and investing at the same time you're usually doing this. And so we spent most of our effort on that, raising the pipe, which ended up being, I think, like $300 million. So there were a bunch of different type of investors you talk to. Some of them, the hedge funds who are, just being savvy, right? And, SPACs have weird warrants. And so there's a lot of like financial engineering type things going on there. But we tended to try to stay away from that and look for long-term investors. So one of the people invested is Breakthrough Energy, which is one of Bill Gates's funds. And what are they trying to do is like, this is trying to solve climate change. That's like our thing. So their time horizons are like, solve climate change, 50 years, right? Like, they're very long. So there's a class of investor that actually doesn't need to be hyped, right? This is the secret about quantum computing, is when I see a lot of the hype going on for these companies, I actually think it just is an indication of who they're talking to. I think the people who are good investors know this is, something you're doing that is 10 years, not 5 years, 20 years, right? It's invested in Intel in, 1960 or whatever, I don't remember, not Intel, but maybe Fairchild or whatever. It's an early investment, right? And so the best people understand that. And a lot of the hype is that there's a lot of money that doesn't understand and it just wants to get on the bandwagon of it doing this. And then it leads to this cycle of overhyping and promising too much. Whereas the best investors do know, and I think about this as like Google and Microsoft, they view quantum computing as an investment, right? Like, Sundar is not doing this out of the generousness of his heart, right? Like, he's doing it because strategically he thinks that in 10 years, Google will still be around and will need to be a world-class quantum computing company, right? And so the longer term thinking, people out there exist, and that was the pleasant part of the experience. The non-pleasant part was the more like hypey, like, we need to get this product moving, right? And trying to, I call it, there's a very famous thing, cargo culting. Feynman has a great thing about this. So cargo culting is apparently like after the Allies left islands after World War II in the Pacific, the people who lived there would come out and do like motions like trying to get airplanes to land, because they had seen people make these motions and then all these things drop from the sky or planes came, right? And that was, they associated the movements with the actual like thing that's going on. And in today's world, there's a lot of cargo culting, which is people going through the motions because something else did it. And so in quantum computing, there's a lot of like making it look like a product when it's not a product yet, right? And so that part drove me slightly nuts, because you're like, IonQ will have to focus now on revenue, when really what they need is what they got, which is they have $500 million in the bank. They can probably, 6-7 years have some reasonably interesting quantum computer that they can sell as a product, right? And that's the trade-off. And the problem is that like they make revenue projections that are just like, that's going to be really hard to hit.
Dave, the pull to come back to Google was pretty strong, though, after just a year.
It was. I mean, I really enjoyed the team that I worked with, and I think it cemented in my head just this notion that we need to focus on the technology and not necessarily the product side of the world yet. And I do now have good experience when Google, however it thinks about its future going forward, I kind of understand where the investors are thinking about this. I think it's a good perspective to have, to see, sort of kind of the temperature of what the world is like right now. So of course interest rates are going up, and so now it all changed.
Right. Dave, we talked about your current work right at the beginning of our talk. So for the last part of our discussion, 2 forward-looking questions to top things off. So first, in terms of the things that you'll be looking for, if you could sort of extrapolate, right? Where are the big initiatives where, for those people who might be impatient, who don't have a timeline where they can conceptualize 10, 20, 30 years in the future, what are the things you might point to that say, okay, here are some benchmarks, here's where we want to be in X number of years, and judge us on that timeline? Or is the premise of the question not even appropriate because things really are still so fundamental that we don't necessarily have the ability to make those benchmarks because we're simply not there yet?
I think you could make the benchmarks, and people have tried to make them. I think the real challenge is that quantum computing is a technology with a ton of moving parts. And so like any benchmark, it's hard to do one that's holistic enough for what we're looking for. I think sort of when thinking about sort of the future and the progress to judge people by, it's again one of these things where the breakthrough, I still think we're missing breakthroughs, and we will see them, and they will be very obvious when they happen, in the sense of like they will tick off all of the boxes of what you need for a sort of better qubit type system, right? And I suspect these will pop up as we go forward. And I think it's hard, because I think my answer really is like we will know it when we see it, and that we're still at the stage where I think we do have enough experience now to know like when things are not just the breakthrough they see, right? When somebody claims that like, oh, I've done this thing and therefore quantum computing is easy, usually those statements today are almost certainly naive, in that like if you ask that to anybody who's tried to build a 10 to 100 qubit quantum computer, they would be like, no, that's not true, right? And so sort of this integrated part of quantum computing is the big challenge. I think also there's just a major question in the field about like which direction's the right one, not in terms of platforms, but there's sort of what Google's pursuing is this brute force approach, right? Like we are going to brute force error correction. We're going to have a large classical compute sitting there helping us do error correction constantly. Whereas Microsoft we're trying to build a qubit, which either has to we may have to do a small amount of error correction, but as minimal as possible, because that's really hard. And instead our qubits are just fundamentally better because they use error correction in the construction of the qubit. To me, that's the big open question, is which of those two is going to triumph. And so far, Microsoft's been, is losing. My good friends at Microsoft, they will not disagree with that in some sense, but their vision is different, right? And so it could be that they're just, on the cusp of totally upending the race. right? And so I think that's going to be the fascinating one. To me, that's the exciting thing. That to me is the exciting race that's going on. Is like, are we going to have better encoded qubits, or are we going to brute force our way forward? And like, I don't know the answer to that, and I suspect in 10 years we'll have like more definitive understanding of like which of those two paths was the right one.
And Dave, finally for you, what are you most optimistic about going forward, and how might that influence or inform what you work on next?
I'm very optimistic about what I call the middle way, which is ways of building quantum computers that involve Microsoft ideas and Google ideas. I think there's a middle path that people are starting to explore. So I think that's a fascinating era. I think I'm also optimistic about algorithms. I think what's happened is the hype bubble started, I don't know, maybe 3 years ago around, sort of the beyond classical experiment. And what happens with hype bubbles is they hit, and a lot of work gets, like the early work isn't as good in some sense, right? But what's happened is the first graduate students who started joining because of that hype bubble are now mature graduate students who are starting to produce results. And so when I look at the quality of work I see coming from a lot of smart people doing a lot of interesting algorithms work, I think we're about to shift. And I think I'm super optimistic about that. I think we're going to have another couple, sort of these years of like post-Shor, where there's just a ton of interesting, fascinating, the invention of error correction occurred during that era. Huge amounts of quantum information were done, right? There was just this velocity of stuff. I suspect we're actually going to hit a similar thing because there's so much money, and that money is being used to support a vast amount of people. And a lot of it is going in the wrong direction. But when you have so much going on, it sort of generates a lot of excellent work. And so I suspect that we don't quite value how much brains are being dumped yet again into quantum computing, and that's going to pay off. And so that makes me pretty optimistic. So for my own work, it's mostly like try to find really smart people to work with, and because they're going to be doing fun and interesting things. And so when I think about what I work on, it's sort of like, where can I find the people who are going to be doing the stuff that we'll talk about in another 10 years, right?
No matter what, it's been a fun trip. It'll continue to be so.
Definitely. It's been a wild, the fact that I left and came back has definitely been a wild ride. It's like I never really thought I'd be coming back and talking about quantum computing. So,
well, Dave, on that note, this has been a lot of fun speaking with you. I'm so glad we were able to do this for the IQI, IQIM. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much.